Yeah, so today I'll be talking about the Ultimate Product-Led Onboarding Playbook. I'm Phil. I'm the co-founder and CPO at a company called Dopt, and we make a platform that helps people build better product-led growth experiences. So things like onboarding, in-app announcements, and product adoption experiences. So this is a really important kind of professional passion area of mine. Before this, I led growth design at Dropbox and was responsible for onboarding across different segments. So over the past many years, this is an area I've gone deep in, and I'm super excited to share my knowledge with everyone here. One thing I just want to echo is please drop questions in the Q&A. I would love to hear from you about what we should cover after. Leading in up to this event, there was a ton of responses in the survey, and that was really helpful for me to figure out what y'all were interested in. Okay, so let's dig in. All right, you're all here because as you know, building great onboarding is super hard, and yet it's one of the biggest drivers of activation and retention, which of course for almost any software business are some of the most important metrics. So I told you a little bit about my background with Dopt and Dropbox. In addition to my experience, I worked with some of the past leaders across growth and growth design, building out this playbook. So there's a wealth of knowledge here, and I think we'll be able to dig into a ton of best practices and useful things. So here's how the product-led onboarding playbook works. There'll be three sections today. The first one will be foundations. This is all about setting the stage, doing the research, and really understanding who your users are and the value that your product delivers to them. Then we'll talk about designing the journey and really thinking about the journey mindset and how important it is to think about all of the different steps that it takes to get a user from discovering your product to being able to get value out of it. And then lastly, we'll talk about guiding users to value, which is really a deep dive into design patterns and best practices. Okay, to start, what is the goal of onboarding? The goal of onboarding is connecting users with the product value that's relevant to them. And this is really important because it sounds simple, but when you get into it, there's oftentimes quite a bit of complexity here. You'll have different types of users. Your users might have different jobs to be done or tasks. And oftentimes your product, or maybe you have multiple products, offers different types of value. So the really important thing here is understanding your users and the unique value your product offers so you can connect users with value that's relevant to them. So that's going to be the framing for the whole talk about what product-led onboarding facilitates. Okay, talking about the foundations. First, let's talk about understanding your users. So you have a set of users who are going to use your product, and they are trying to achieve something. There's a lot of different terms in the world, like jobs to be done or top tasks, or oftentimes use cases. I'm not going to be precious about these terms in this talk. The most important thing is that you understand who your user is, sometimes called like ideal customer profile, and the types of things that they're trying to achieve. And this is really more like what they're trying to achieve in their life to get value, not a product feature or not a product workflow, but really what's something that they're trying to achieve. And I'll talk about some examples. Oops, it didn't load. Okay, and then you've got your product or your products, and there's a core value which is unique and differentiated. And again, we're going to be talking about connecting users with that core value in your product. Okay, so let's talk about some examples. While I was at Dropbox, we had users with multiple jobs to be done. And again, this is a good example about when you start to think about connecting users with value that's relevant for them. At Dropbox, we had users who had different use cases. Some wanted to back up photos, some wanted to access files anywhere, and others wanted to collaborate with coworkers. All pretty different use cases. And so the trick for us was thinking about how do we know which use case a user has so we can help them use Dropbox and understand the value the best for them. Or you might have users might have different types of users with different jobs to be done. So here's, for example, Airtable or a lot of horizontal SaaS. You might have a PM who wants to use Airtable to capture feedback, and you might have a marketer who wants to use Airtable to manage campaigns. So they actually have very different tasks, but they'll be using the same product to achieve those goals. Your job will be to connect those users with the right value. So how do you do that? I think the best way to understand your users is simply talking with them. And it sounds deceivingly simple, but it's really easy to get disconnected for your users. So one of my biggest kind of call to action for this talk will be take the time and talk with users. And it doesn't matter if you're in marketing or you're in product or you're in customer success or you're designers. Really, if you're working on onboarding, you need to be talking with users. Don't outsource this. It's going to be the best way for you to understand how to build effective product-led onboarding. Okay. The second foundation, audit onboarding user experiences. I'm not going to go super deep here. The most important thing is take a moment and go wide. Look at direct competitors so you can see people who are solving similar problems to you. Look at adjacent problems or products. So if you're building a developer tool, um, look at other developer tools, and then look at best of breed products. Basically, these are the products that you know and have heard of have great onboarding. One tactical recommendation, there's a tool called Mobbin, and oh, it looks like the video. Yeah. So basically, um, it has a whole library of flows, and it makes it super easy to just copy the flow. And it's like the whole onboarding flow that they've audited for you. And you can go into Figma and just paste it right in. It's an insane time saver, and it's super, super useful to be able to audit a ton of different onboarding flows. It is paid, but if you're going to be built working on onboarding, it's well worth it. The other thing you can do is you can make auditing fun. So you can build practice or growth culture about getting people together to do these audits and teardowns so you can get the team on the same page. Okay, the next foundation is identifying opportunities within your current onboarding experience. So to do this, you're going to have to use your product and use your product as if you were a new user. So you'll create a new account, sign up for your product, map every step, watch session recordings if you have them, and layer in quantitative data, again, if you have them. I think the key here is don't be super precious. If you don't have session recording or you don't have great quantitative data yet, that's okay. Just do enough to get started so you can start to work on your onboarding. Um, so I'll give you a couple examples. When we were at Dropbox, one of the onboarding teams did exactly this. And when we audited the onboarding flow, we had more than 40 steps. And you don't know that because you're often as an internal user thinking about the use stage as opposed to the discover and evaluate or try stage. So starting as a new user will really be eye-opening about how you frame your product, where points of friction are. The other thing is if you do have quantitative data, really go deep and show where the data maps to specific points in the journey. This is going to be really helpful identifying where opportunities live. I love this from Lauren, head of product growth. In addition to just, I think it's really easy to get lost because oftentimes there's a lot of experiences and there's a lot of data. So really focus on where you see churn that does correlate with activation and retention. And I'll talk more about how to measure activation and retention a little bit later. So what might this look like? Here's a great template about mapping flows where you can say like, oh, this is a really great moment, or maybe this isn't such a great moment. And there's a really cool onboarding audit template made by the folks at Growth Designers that you can get if you search onboarding audit template on Figma. And I love this this template. It's really, really great. Okay, last foundation is getting in a learning mindset. I think this is one of the hardest things about growth is that you really want to be experimental and iterative, but I think that does need to be balanced with making sure you know where you want to go and designing a North Star. A practice we found really useful at Dropbox was thinking about a North Star and then designing an iterative experimental path. I think it's really easy to boil the ocean, especially if you looked at like best of breed products in the world. You might want to build exactly what they have. The truth is that an iterative experimental path is going to end with a better result than doing one massive change at once. So I'll give you a good example. At Dropbox, we had this kind of three-phase approach where you'll see we had a phase one here with a couple of changes. And what we would do is basically have some success criteria with that phase. And if it was successful, we would then move on to phase two and three. Of course, if it wasn't successful, we would iterate. We would take those learnings and iterate. Or if we didn't think there was actually an opportunity area, we would completely ditch the project. And you can even get to a kind of a lower level and say, like, what are the types of experiments we're building? So how does a buy page work with a plus onboarding? And this will be one experiment in a broader kind of experimental plan like this. So take a learning and iterative mindset because that will help you know if you're on the right track. Okay, so those are the foundations to help you get started, and I'll reference those foundations throughout the talk. Now let's talk a little bit about designing the journey. And I think that thinking about onboarding as a journey is the most effective way to think about how a user will experience, and it will help you bring in all the multifaceted considerations that are on our minds when we're building onboarding. Everything from what's the user experience? How do we work with marketing? How do we work with sales? So the journey mindset is really, really effective. And there are two journeys that I want to talk about. The first is the end-to-end journey. The end-to-end journey is just taking a step back and thinking about your user from the very first moment they discover what your product is to when they decide to use it. And these are things like really the first touch point, like landing pages, SEO, social. Maybe they went to an event. Word of mouth is a big way people discover products. From those moments, they'll get into areas where they'll try and evaluate it, especially with product-led onboarding. The try and evaluate stage happens in the product. So they'll sign up, they'll start a trial, they'll go through onboarding, but they'll look at a lot of other things too, like your product pages, your docs, your pricing. They might also look at support. And finally, they'll commit and they'll convert and they'll check out. The reason this is important is that the way you do onboarding, which is in the middle here, will depend on who your users are and what value they're looking for in the discover stage. Furthermore, some of the discovery will happen in product through upsell and cross-sell or organic in-app discovery. If you're a multi-product company, you might have a navigation. That navigation will have different types of products. When a user is using a product, they'll just organically discover that you offer more value. If it's relevant to them, they'll determine that they want to try and evaluate it. So when I get into the onboarding journey, I'll talk a little bit about why these are so important. Okay, and I'll give you an example here about one of the discover, evaluate, commit journeys that we had at Dropbox. So these were new users, and we mapped it out. We call these noodle diagrams, and I think in growth, again, thinking in journeys is so important because it's able to map a user journey across discover, evaluate, commit, and then activate. And for some trial apps, it's worth saying that the activation might happen sooner, and users might actually just jump right into your product to try it and evaluate it. So you could remix that in product activate and associate that with evaluate if you'd like. But the point here is that this is doing a lot of the almost like segmentation and determining who is going to end up in onboarding. So you can see a user might go through a journey and land at a page that's relevant to plus, and then get onboarding for plus, or they might land at a SEO or SEM page with a very specific value prop. And then if you can translate that value prop into an in-app experience, your onboarding will be super, super effective because it will be connecting users with relevant value, like I talked about with the goal. So here's how we kind of framed it at Dropbox. And then we went through and we kind of prototyped what these experiences would look like. Here's the discover experience, the homepage. Here's the evaluate experience, a product page. Here's a commit experience, the checkout page. And then finally, the activation experience. Let's say this is Dropbox Plus. Well, this is amazing because now we know all of the things a user saw leading up to landing in product. And we can think, are the value props aligned? Did we communicate what the product was going to be valuable for? What's a user's expectation when they land in the product? The discover, evaluate, commit journey will build momentum. So when they land in the product, you're ready to give them relevant experiences. And again, this experience works really well with that phased approach. Okay, that's the end-to-end journey. That sets the stage for the onboarding journey. Once a user lands in your product, the onboarding journey has three important steps: setup moment, aha moment, and a habit loop. The setup is pretty straightforward. It's the steps your users or teams need to take to get to the point where they can experience the core value. Especially in SaaS, these are things like our B2B. Oftentimes you'll be asking questions about who a user is so you can know more about them to deliver more relevant experiences. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit. You might have some integrations that are really important, and your user won't be able to realize the value of the product unless they set up an integration. If you're a dev tool, maybe they need to authenticate with GitHub because that's the only way they can take out a pull request. There's no way for them to achieve the value that your product offers without setting up the integration. If you're a collaboration app, the value of the product is derived from collaborating. So inviting team members is often a part of the setup. A little case study from Dropbox when one of the teams redesigned the mobile app. Uh, this was one of the most impactful experiences for driving more conversion. It seems so simple, but there's a lot that goes into this. These are basically the jobs to be done: back up my photos, share photos or file, scan documents, access my files anywhere. And these are specific jobs to be done to mobile users in the mobile platform. So there's a lot of research that we talked about from the foundation section that goes into creating an experience like this that actually resonates with users because these are value that they're looking for. So you can now create experiences that connect them with the value as a good example of tailoring your onboarding experience to different types of value that users might have. Okay, I think maybe one other thing I'll say about the setup before moving up to AHA, you really do want to be focused on the key setup moments. Um, and don't tack on too much. Once you have a good idea about what your value is, try to do the minimum as possible. Keep it simple. Okay, so for aha moment, this is basically when when your user experiences the core value, and this correlates with retention, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a bit. A couple of examples from some of the people I worked with when creating this. Loom's aha moment is when a creator gets their first view. This is really cool because if you think about their journey, that means that the user has already created a Loom and they've sent it to someone, and someone then sees it. So it's pretty deep into that user journey if you were to map it out like we talked about. Furthermore, Janie does a great job of talking about this from a psychological and cognitive perspective, just because Loom is an app that changes behavior. So what's wonderful about saying like, okay, if Loom's aha moment is when a creator gets their first view, you can almost work backwards about what are all the touch points leading up to that moment. Superhuman's aha moment is when a user takes 50 clearing actions, which is basically managing their inbox. I like this because it's a little bit of a remix. Sometimes people think that the aha moment is one single action. Gorov and Superhuman defines it where there's multiple, which basically represents like when it's a proxy for when a user understands the Superhuman email workflow. I like this example because it just shows that you don't need to be super precious about uh, taking these best practices into your product. Think about your unique product and do what works best for you. Okay, so how to determine the aha moment? Like I talked about, it's really the moment a user realizes the value of their product. And what you want to do is you want to see if it correlates with mid to long-term retention or paid conversion. If you're a new product or you're a startup, you might not have enough data about retention and paid conversion. So the first thing you really want to focus on is when customers are using it and coming back at an expected rate. And that actually might take a long time. So if you're really early, it's totally okay to not know a lot about your retention or paid conversion. But what you're really trying to do is build a sticky product, and understanding your core value will still help you get to that moment. As you get more mature, then you can start to map your aha moment to long-term retention or paid conversion. And one kind of step in the more mature would be running a series of experiments to prove causality between your activation metric and retention. So you can prove that, let's say, a user creates a Loom and shares it with someone and gets a view. You can show that there's causality between that and activation metric retention. It's easy to get lost. Keep this part simple. Um, Using quantitative data if you're a startup can be a distraction. Using insane quantitative data if you're a mature company can actually be a distraction. We went on a couple of journeys at Dropbox where we did a lot of data science to figure out, all of these kind of correlation and causality. And oftentimes, even though the data proved that there was a relationship, it didn't always translate to be an effective aha moment. There were a lot of questions about what's a good activation rate. I'm just going to say that Lenny's newsletter has the best resource here that I've seen. So if you search what's a good activation rate, he'll break it down by product type, and that's definitely the best place to go look. Okay, so the habit loop. This is when a user or team builds a habit around the core product, and again, this should correlate with long-term retention even more strongly than the aha moment. Um, For an analytics tool, that could be something like creating 4 charts in the first 14 days. For an email tool, it could be like triaging 20 emails in the first 7 days. Um, for a spreadsheet tool, it could be like collaborating with 3 or more users on 2 or more sheets in the first 30 days. So you can see now this is a little bit more time bound and they're a little bit further into understanding your product's value. Um, and you can see how Superhuman drew a line from their clearing action into a habit loop and trying to get towards inbox zero, ideally on a weekly basis. Okay, so one thing I want to talk about in terms of this journey is good friction versus bad friction. And I think that there's kind of a truism that like you want to reduce friction in onboarding. And um, that's not always true. What you really want to do is you want to make sure that you understand who your users are so you can deliver relevant value to them. Sometimes that means introducing good friction. And what that might look like is some of the profiling questions we talked about before. Knowing who a user is and what they're here to do with your product will help you build a better experience to help them understand and realize the value. Furthermore, some of the experiences we'll talk about in just a moment could be considered friction. But the idea is that once you have these foundations about who your user is, the value your product offers, and the journey they're going to go on, you can know that the friction you're introducing with those experiences is actually directing them towards realizing the value. And that is okay. That is good friction. Furthermore, I would say that like if a user drops off at the stage, um, they might not have a lot of high intent, so it's fine to lose them if you can deliver a better experience to the ones who do complete this. Okay, I'm going to speed through some of this stuff because we're nearing the time, but I got a lot of questions about how to work with marketing and sales with product-led onboarding. I love this question because growth and onboarding is a cross-team, cross-functional practice. It's so, so important to bring everyone into the fold. So with onboarding and marketing, one of the reasons I love the Discover, Evaluate, Commit is it's a framework that shows how the marketing journey set the stage for product-led onboarding. So you can know that as a user discovers your product, that's going to set the stage for how you want to onboard them. So it's really important to work with marketing counterparts. Furthermore, when you think about a user's journey, you can think about how to orchestrate it. If a user has not yet realized the value that they're there to get, don't send them upsells. So if you've aligned on what that journey looks like and you know what the aha moment is, don't send things like monetization emails or like, have you considered trying enterprise? If the user's like, I haven't tried anything, because you're distracting them from getting to the aha moment and the habit loop. Furthermore, for sales-led growth, there's a ton of different places across the journey where we'll have intent signals and you can build in hand-raising experiences. These are things like support, book time with us, or contextual signals. This is a great example. I love how Loom built in Help Center, reach out to support, and feedback, which is great. Those are all good entry points. Even more interesting is that for more qualified paying customers, they also created an entry point for admins specifically to chat with the sales team. I love that. That's thinking about who is a type of user, an admin who has a specific need that can get hooked into a sales-led process to help them realize the value of a product. Okay, so bonus, there's a bunch of other stuff that's really important. Like, how do you think about driving account activation for B2B? How do you think about tailoring your onboarding to different types of users? And after a user gets to the habit loop, how do you continuously onboard them to new um, value and continue monetization experiences? And those are all bonus experiences I'm not going to cover. I will just say there's more on our blog, and you can go read more there. But the other call to action, you need to be talking with your users and you need to be thinking in journeys. Those two things will set you up for success. Okay, lastly, guiding users to value, onboarding best practices and patterns. Again, the whole playbook here is who are your users? What's the core value? Now we're going to talk about that red squiggly line about the actual experiences to guide them to the value. Stay grounded in the journey. The whole practice is built around understanding where to introduce good friction to get them to the value, to guide users to relevant value. Practice progressive disclosure, don't show everything all at once, and consider contextual experiences. Those are some of the best practices. In terms of onboarding patterns, there's kind of a suite of patterns that I've identified here, and these are definitely mix and match. And so I think that the playbook, once you understand your users, the type of product you have and the value it delivers, will help you determine what patterns are best for your product. So for example, if you have a cold start problem and high activation friction, like let's say you're a data app, like your Amplitude and you need to have data, or maybe you're a monitoring platform. And so it's really hard to monitor if you don't have data from your applications. You might consider a demo sandbox. And what a demo sandbox can do is show a user what your product looks like as if it was populated with data. Or for a B2C example, which I love, Mercury recently released personal banking, and you can go and see a demo of what your bank account would look like if you were banking with them. I think a lot of times you can imagine that switching bank accounts is a really high friction experience. It's a really consequential decision. It can be scary. Looking at a demo can help a user understand, if I do work with Mercury, this is what it could look like. And that's an early important step in the onboarding journey to build momentum. Let's see, it's frozen. Okay. So let's say you're a SaaS app that has one key workflow, like you're superhuman. It's all about managing your inbox. You can build an interactive tutorial that's all about managing your inbox. Let's say you're a horizontal SaaS. You have a bunch of different use cases. You might use a couple of different uh, patterns, like templates and a checklist and preloaded data. So Miro, for example, uses templates to help users get started. If you're a dev tool, maybe you want to have an onboarding hub. So you can have a specific place a user can return to learn more about that product as they continue a kind of multi-surface area journey. If you're vertical SaaS, you might want to have preloaded data, and that's what Linear does. I love this because Linear is kind of the crowning achievement of like simplicity, and they still are really have an interesting onboarding where you basically onboard their product by using their product. Okay, again, there's a whole list of these on our blog. So if you want to know more about the specific patterns and when to use them when they're good, go check it out. Dopt.com is the blog, and you can just find the ultimate product onboarding. Okay, I'm going to breeze through this, but there were quite a few questions about what's the future of product-led onboarding. In particular, what about AI? And a big question like, should I AI? And I would say, if you're AI first, horizontal SaaS, creative tools, or dev tools, there's a really good opportunity to use AI. Figma is super interesting because they've started to replace templates with AI prompts, which is interesting because it does still kind of achieve the same goal as templates, but you can personalize them with your own prompt. So I love this example of like what the future might look like when it's appropriate to apply AI. I will say that it is not yet a silver bullet. AI onboarding gets you to about halfway there. You still need traditional methods to get a user all the way to the core value. This might change in the future. I'm super excited to see where it goes, but this is definitely the current state of AI in onboarding. Okay, so there we go. We talked about the foundations, thinking in journeys, and then patterns and best practices to guide users to value. And that's the product-led onboarding playbook. Okay, um, I'll take a look at the Q&A and see what some of the top questions are. Let's see. I'm going to refresh. Yeah, so how this applies to B2B, where the end user you want to activate is not the same as the decision maker, and it was not involved in the marketing and sales process. I think this is a really good question. I think I think about like product-led growth and sales-led growth as a spectrum, and always complementary, but your business may or may not bias towards one more than the other. Obviously, if you're here, you're probably considering part of a product-led experience. And the product-led growth experience is going to be great for those end users. It might also be good for decision makers or admins or the purchase the person who's going to buy it because they might go into their product. But I do think that you want to map out the journey with all those users that you're considering key kind of ICPs, and also think about it from a end-to-end discover, evaluate, commit. And I think what you'll find is that your buyer oftentimes will be a part of the discover and evaluate journey. They'll go to your website, they'll learn about the value you provide. Maybe they'll even have a sales call with your CEO or salesperson. And so what you want to do is be able to know how that kind of like oftentimes it's called like bottoms up or product led user path works with a sales path. You could add a couple different variations. You might have a user who lands and goes through your journey and gets to an aha moment and then needs to talk with a decision maker to go through a sales process. But now you've just accelerated that sales process. An alternative is you might have a call with the salesperson early in the journey, and then that champion or the decision maker might get some of their end users into the product to go through more of the like evaluate, like try and evaluate stage. So the biggest thing that you want to do is just map out what's effective in your organization from a sales and marketing and product led and understand how the journey should work so you get maximum leverage. Um, okay, so let's see. Another one. Do you have a framework that you like for those onboarding focused customer interviews? Oh, that's a really good question. When we started Dopt, the first thing we basically did was like ran almost like 100 interviews to understand who our ICP was. And the most effective, there's a book called The Mom Test that I really like. And what the Mom Test is good for is it's basically a framework that makes sure you're staying grounded in customer context. So it's going to be things like, what's your biggest problem? When's the last time you encountered that problem? Why haven't you considered alternatives? Do you have you done any workarounds? And so there's a whole set of really good questions that you ask before you ask anything about, was the onboarding effective? Do you have any feedback on the UI? Those are good questions to ask, but it's most important that in these customer facing interviews, you're really focused on the customer, uh, their problem, and their perceived value in your product, because then you can start to think about that as some of the foundations to build the journey. Of course, if they're going through a product experience, you should ask about, is this a good UI? But those are secondary in importance to really some of the customer centric questions that are so important to building good onboarding. Okay, another one. Can you give your insights on onboarding email sequences? Um, for instance, how to guide a user to the aha moment and ideas in terms of user behavior segmentation. One of the reasons I love the journey mindset is it gives you a great canvas to layer in onboarding email sequences. And for sure, the best practices with onboarding email is to be, you'll typically have campaigns that are both time-based and behavioral based. So you might have a time-based sequence. If you have a 14-day trial, you'll have some number of, like emails that will get sent across those 14 days. And a behavioral, like when a user, for example, sets up an integration, you might be like, nice, you just set up an integration and you can reinforce the value that a user got as an integration. Or maybe you just created your first project and you know the best next step is to invite people to the project. You'd be like, nice, you just created your project. Maybe you should consider inviting people. So the onboarding email sequence is a great way to build momentum about next steps. And it's also a really good way to get users back into your product. Those are the two best ways they're used. In terms of best practices, I would say I've got some resources in the blog post about how to think about like behaviorally driven and time-based sequences. That's a great place to look. Okay, so how much time do you spend on the first step? Basically, who are your users? Oftentimes, startups jump into tours and steps without really spending time in the stage, and some founders are afraid of spending so much time on this. Um, I think that what's interesting about spending time on the users is that if a company has been founded, there's some implicit hypothesis about who your users are and their jobs to be done. So there's going to be some institutional knowledge. I've found that um, in general, biasing towards speed for onboarding is important. This is an area I would spend a little bit of time to get right, but in addition to talking with users, I would consider talking with marketing and sales to understand what they've heard the value of your product is, talking to your leadership, because it's really important that you're going to be aligned with who your users is and their job to be done. And then I think the obviously the primary source of talking with users is going to be really important. I would say that you can typically start to get pretty good pattern matches with 5 to 7 interviews. So you don't need to do, I mean, when we were starting Dopt, we did 100, but that's because we were totally exploring. More likely than not, 5 to 7 should you'll be able to pattern match. If you have different types of personas, you might need a little bit more. Like let's say you have a marketer and you have a PM, you might need to talk with 5 of each persona. But either way, I think you should be able to get move pretty quickly. Okay, so the next question, do you need to build different onboarding flows for different use cases? How do you understand what use case the new users will need? Great question. And this is why I think that the foundation section is so important because as you talk with your users, you'll hear what their most important use cases are. And do you need to build different onboarding flows for different use cases? I think is a really great question, which gets into like best practices, especially because a lot of SaaS apps are kind of platformy, and so they have a lot of different use cases, um, or they support a lot of different use cases. Again, I'll use the Airtable example. I think whether or not it ends up being two distinct flows is up to you and your judgment about the right design of onboarding. But if you know your users have multiple use cases and those use cases do map to the core value, then you will need to consider how your onboarding flow supports them for different use cases. Airtable is a great example because um, they offer a bunch of different touch points. Their setup experience, you kind of customize it to your use case and you see what it looks like for your use case. Then they have templates. Again, you can check which template might like help your use case. And then they have a checklist that's not use case specific. So you can go through and learn how to use Airtable in the context of your specific use case. So again, it's pretty interesting because it's a horizontal product, but they've done like 3 distinct moments where it's all use case centric, which I love. I think that's like a really strong user-centered, use case centered onboarding flow. Let's see. What's the biggest win you worked on at Dropbox working in growth design, and why was it so impactful? Oh, this is a really good question. So my time at Dropbox worked across a bunch of different stages. Within the like discover, evaluate, commit, some of the most important uh, impactful experiments were things like thinking about re-architecting the navigation and the information architecture because that was kind of the almost like signposts for where to find value that was relevant, and then following those paths to a buy. So, you might have a user who's interested in backing up photos, finding backing up photos path and getting into understanding that Dropbox does solve their problem there. So that's a really big one. I think what was interesting about some of the experiments at Dropbox on the onboarding side was we used to have a tour, and we found that people dismissed the tour and they just felt like it was overlaid. So we got rid of the tour and we built in more contextual onboarding where it was more focused on less showing you about the interface and more about helping you upload your first file. And I love that because it's all about what's like action or what's a moment where they can get aha, and backing up your files is the huge aha. So rather than going through a 5-step journey about look at our wonderful interface, it was more like, hey user, we are a backup storage solution that is super safe and secure. You should back up your files. And that was really, really impactful. All right. I think we're nearing time. I'll answer maybe one more question. Um, Yeah, so early stage company is onboarding every user personally. It's so good for learning and developing client relationships, but it takes a ton of time. I couldn't agree more. But this is a wonderful playbook to starting. This is how we started Adopt. I would say this is like best practice for building a startup. I think that yeah, at what point do you recommend pivoting product-led onboarding? Is definitely you're gonna have to. There's been a lot of writing about this in the world, but if product-led growth is right for your product, and I didn't get so much into this because I kind of assumed that if you're here, you're thinking it is, but there's really good writing in the world about if you should go product-led at all, which has to do with like how easy is it for a user to realize the value of your product independently. If you think that's the right motion, as soon as you have repeatability, I would recommend getting started on the product-led onboarding because the whole point here is to iterate and learn. The trade-off is you start having less personal conversations, and so that learning diminishes. But if you've already identified key patterns and insights, then you can start to move people. And the idea here is then you have less friction for users to get into your product, so the overall user volume should go up. So I would say I would bias towards moving towards it sooner. And you can do interesting things like um, if you have a wait list because you're talking with everyone, you could say, and we did this in Dopt, you could say, hey, we're opening up our self-serve onboarding to people on a weekly basis. You're part of this cohort, let them in, see how it goes. You just learned a lot, make it better. Next week, let in another 10 people, see how it goes. And so, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be a light switch moment. You can phase it to build and learn. Okay. Thanks so much, everyone. I think we're at time, so I'll call it at that. Awesome questions. Thanks so much for joining. I really enjoyed it, and I hope this was useful.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Phil.